A single piece of paper, locked away for decades, has just changed the entire future of the British monarchy. It wasn't a battle cry or a public speech. It was a quiet, legal document that arrived at the palace on a Tuesday morning, and it has left the king with nowhere to turn. This is the story of how the quietest member of the royal family turned the tables on the king, using his parents' own signatures as his weapon. It was a normal Tuesday morning when a special envelope arrived at Buckingham Palace. It was delivered not by the usual palace courier, but by a very important lawyer from a top firm in London. The envelope had a heavy red wax seal on it, and it wasn't just any seal. It was the private seal of the late Queen Elizabeth herself. King Charles finished his morning tea before he opened it, not knowing the bomb that was about to go off in his office. When he finally broke the seal and read the first page, his whole world seemed to stop. His private secretary was standing by the window, waiting for him to sign some papers, but the king just stared at the document. He didn't speak for a whole minute. This wasn't a friendly letter from his brother. It was a legal document that said Prince Edward officially owned a huge chunk of the family's private wealth, and the king couldn't do anything about it. This wasn't just a random attack. The timing was perfect. For months, the palace had been dealing with a lot of public pressure, and King Charles had been working hard to make the monarchy smaller and more efficient. He wanted to save money, and he wanted total control over all the royal properties and funds. He thought he had a plan to make the family leaner, but this new document threatened to break that plan completely. The document laid out a very specific list of lands, historical treasures, and personal income that now belonged to Prince Edward. For 3 years, everyone thought Edward was happy to follow along with the king's new rules. He always smiled for the cameras and did his duties without complaining. He accepted his new title and never said a bad word about his reduced role. But behind that quiet smile, he was working with lawyers to dig through the private archives of Windsor and Balmoral, looking for exactly this kind of legal weapon. The core of this argument is a distinction that most people don't understand. There is a giant difference between the crown estate, which is like the public property of the monarch, and the sovereign's private wealth, which is like the king's personal money. The crown estate cannot be sold off or divided up easily. But the private wealth, which includes things like personal investments, private homes like Sandringham, and huge collections of art and jewelry, is different. Queen Elizabeth had total control over this personal money, and she could leave it to anyone she wanted. King Charles believed that as the new king, he inherited total control over all these private holdings. He thought he could use this power to squeeze his younger brother. He cut Edward's allowances, demanded he explain every expense, and even suggested he move out of his longtime family home. He wanted everyone to depend on him for approval. But that morning, the document on his desk changed that reality in an instant. Inside the document was a photocopy of a legal change made to the Queen's will in 1998. It had the signatures of the Queen, Prince Philip, and a very important former government lawyer. This wasn't a casual family note written on palace paper. It was a powerful, unbreakable legal document. It clearly set aside a massive part of the private estate just for Edward and his children. The money involved is staggering. We are talking about tens of millions of pounds that come not from taxpayer money, but from commercial land leases in the south of England. Charles had already planned to use this money to pay for upgrades to Buckingham Palace. Now, that money is frozen and he can't touch it. When the king's lawyers arrived at the palace, they took one look at the document and knew they were in trouble. The signatures were real, and the legal framework was ironclad. Queen Elizabeth had seen the future. She knew older brothers often forget about their younger siblings once they get the top job, so she took steps to protect her youngest son. This news created an immediate crisis inside the palace. Staff were whispering about what this could mean for the future. If Edward can legally challenge the king's financial power, then others might try the same thing. Prince Andrew, for example, is currently fighting to keep his home at the Royal Lodge, and he is watching Edward's case very closely. If Edward's lawyers prove that the late queen's wishes can override the current king's orders, the entire hierarchy of the palace could fall apart. The document also included a list of historic artifacts that Edward now owns. These aren't just items on display in the castle museums. They are private family heirlooms, rare paintings, and a huge collection of vintage carriages and equestrian equipment that Charles had planned to display in a public exhibition. Now, all of that belongs to Edward. The tension in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife as the lawyers explained the king's options. He could fight this in a private court, which would risk leaking secret financial information, or he could give in and admit that his younger brother now holds an independent source of power and wealth. Edward's team gave the palace a strict deadline. They had just 7 business days to respond. If they didn't agree, Edward's lawyers were prepared to take the whole thing to the High Court. A public lawsuit between the king and his brother would destroy the image of a stable, modern monarchy that Charles had worked so hard to build. He stared at the broken pieces of red wax scattered across his desk, realizing that his mother had left behind a hidden legal minefield, and his quiet brother had just stepped on the trigger. This sudden power move revealed a side of Prince Edward that the public had never seen. He is no longer the quiet, gentle, theater loving prince who avoids conflict. He is acting like a sharp, seasoned businessman. He waited until the king's new administrative reforms were fully underway, and until Charles couldn't easily change his plans without massive public embarrassment. His private secretary picked up the heavy legal folder to take it to the lawyer's office, the rustling paper sounding like thunder in the silent room. Charles walked to the window and looked out at the perfectly manicured gardens. Outside, everything seemed to be order and control. But inside, the entire structure of the monarchy was fracturing. The quietest prince had just delivered a masterpiece of legal warfare, leaving the king officially on notice. The big question is, can the palace find a way to fight a document signed by 3 of the most powerful legal minds of the last century? Or will Charles be forced to hand over the keys to an empire within an empire? So, why did the quietest brother wait 3 long years to make his move? To understand that, we have to go back to a rainy evening in November, 2 years ago. Prince Edward was sitting in the back of a black car, holding a green plastic folder filled with papers. He was returning from a tense meeting at Clarence's house, where his personal staff budget had just been cut by 25%. The king, his older brother, had sat across a small table and used his fountain pen to simply cross out 3 important staff positions from Edward's household. One of those people was his senior equerry, a man who had managed Edward's charity work for 15 years. Charles said the public money could no longer support such operations, and Edward didn't argue. He just said thank you, gathered his papers, and left the room. To the world, Edward remained the picture of royal loyalty. He stood on the palace balcony during state visits, he wore his military uniforms with pride, and he traveled to fulfill his duties as the new duke. The royal commentators praised him for being the dependable brother who never caused trouble. They compared him to Prince Harry and Prince Andrew, who were seen as problems. But the public didn't know that his silence was not compliance, it was a strategy. Edward knew that if he fought his brother in the first year, he would lose. The king had all the power, the momentum of his new crown, and the full backing of the treasury. If Edward had complained, he would have looked greedy and whiny to a public struggling with high bills. So he needed time. He needed to find the structural weakness in his brother's new regime. He started by looking back at the promises made during his wedding in 1999. When he married Sophie, the palace had issued a press release saying he would one day get the title Duke of Edinburgh. It was his father's explicit wish. But the statement left out one crucial detail. It didn't mention the money. Prince Philip had spent 50 years building an independent network of investments tied directly to that title. When Philip died, Charles inherited everything as the eldest son. When Charles became king, those assets technically merged with the crown, but Edward knew something was off. For months, Edward asked for an update on his father's specific trusts, but the palace financial office kept giving him the runaround. They claimed they were still sorting out the tax bills. So Edward hired his own team. He didn't use the traditional palace law firms. He went to an independent firm in London that specialized in estate disputes. The main investigator was a former land registry expert who knew exactly how the royal land systems worked. They spent 18 months tracking specific money movements from 1965 to 1995. They discovered that Prince Philip had quietly bought several pieces of commercial real estate using his own personal wealth, not crown money. He registered these properties under a special company structure designed to bypass normal inheritance rules. His goal was to create a permanent fund just for his youngest son. Charles was completely unaware of this research. He was focused on his image as a modernizer, planning to open up Balmoral and Windsor to more tourists to make more money. He was running the family like a corporate business, and in his mind, Edward was just an employee who would accept whatever salary he was given. The king's advisors assumed Edward was too weak to fight. The turning point came during a family dinner at Sandringham. Charles casually mentioned a plan to repurpose some old agricultural buildings near Edward's own estate. He wanted to turn them into commercial rentals run by the Crown Estate Commissioners, which would have stripped Edward of his local management rights and put Crown employees right on his doorstep. Edward listened calmly, took a sip of water, and then changed the subject to sports. The next morning, he authorized his lawyers to draft the first formal warning letter. They didn't send it through the internal palace mail. They delivered it by recorded courier directly to the king's solicitor. The letter didn't contain emotional pleas about family loyalty or their father's memory. It was cold, hard facts, dates, land registry numbers, and financial totals proving that Charles had been spending money that didn't belong to the crown. This created a massive accounting nightmare. If Charles had to return 3 years of rental income from those lands, it would wreck the entire royal budget. The palace had already spent that money on building repairs, and they couldn't easily ask Parliament for more. The mystery deepens when you look at the exact wording of Prince Philip's final trust documents. There is a clause that mentions the concept of a sovereign default. Philip knew a future monarch might try to take these private assets, so he inserted a penalty. If the reigning monarch ever tried to seize or interfere with these funds, the entire trust would automatically be transferred to an independent board of trustees outside the country. This would remove the wealth from the United Kingdom entirely, placing it outside the king's legal reach. If Charles pushes too hard, he triggers this offshore clause, and that would be a public relations disaster. His legal team spent 48 hours trying to find a flaw in Philip's corporate structure, but they found nothing. The late Duke had built a perfect financial fortress around his favorite child. Edward's 3 year delay was a deliberate pacing strategy. He waited until the king's administration was locked into its long-term financial commitments. He waited until Charles had signed new agreements with the Treasury. By waiting for this exact moment, Edward ensured that Charles had no room to move. The king cannot rewrite his budget without exposing the whole dispute to the National Audit Office. The quiet brother played the long game. He smiled for the cameras, he let his staff be reduced, and he let everyone believe he was powerless. Now he stands as the only family member who has successfully blocked the king's path. Now, let's go back to the very beginning, the 60-year promise written in invisible ink. In March of 1963, Prince Philip sat at his writing desk at Sandringham. He clicked open a fountain pen and signed a thick piece of parchment. Two trusted naval officers watched him sign it before the paper was placed in a steel lockbox. This document remained untouched for exactly 60 years. It wasn't stored in the royal archives at Windsor Castle. It was kept in the private vaults of a family bank. Edward's legal team only found it 4 months ago, and what it contained completely reshaped everything we thought we knew about royal inheritance. The text outlined a specific agreement between Prince Philip and Queen Elizabeth about their family planning. Their youngest son, Edward, was born a year after this document was signed. Philip wanted a financial guarantee for his unborn youngest son, even before he entered the world, to make sure he would be cared for. To understand the legal facts, we have to look back to 1952. When Queen Elizabeth became queen, she owned the vast crown lands. But Prince Philip had no right to that wealth. He depended entirely on a parliamentary allowance. To build his own fortune, he started investing in commercial timber yards, manufacturing hubs, and agricultural properties. He used his own salary and private inheritances from his European relatives to fund these purchases. Over the next few decades, his portfolio grew significantly, generating hundreds of thousands of pounds each year. But he didn't put this money back into the general family pool. He directed his accountants to deposit it all into a separate entity called the Southern Counties Trust. He used a 19th century legal loophole that allowed a royal to hold private wealth completely hidden from the treasury. Tension over this arrangement started brewing during the early years of King Charles's time as Prince of Wales. Charles was studying the finances of his own estate and realized that several prime commercial properties on his borders actually belonged to his father's private trust. He wanted to merge these border properties into his estate to increase his own income. Philip refused in a heated argument. He told Charles that the Southern Counties Trust was completely off limits. The reason for this refusal was a well-kept palace secret. Philip knew that the British Constitution heavily favors the firstborn son. The Prince of Wales automatically gets the immense wealth of his own estate. The reigning monarch gets another estate and the crown estate. Younger siblings get nothing but a temporary allowance that can be taken away at any moment. Philip saw this as deeply unfair to his younger children, especially Edward, who showed little interest in business. This brings us to the core mystery of the current legal battle. How could a private trust signed in 1963 override the powers of a reigning king in the 21st century? The answer lies in the specific legal structure of the Duke of Edinburgh title itself. When the title was created for Philip in 1947, the official documents included a unique inheritance clause. It said that the title would go back to the crown when Philip died, but the physical property assets attached to the name could be assigned independently by the holder through a private deed of gift. Charles believed that because the title reverted to the crown, all the property automatically became his. He took control of the keys to several historic storage facilities and reassigned the leases on three lucrative commercial farms. He assumed the matter was settled because he was the king. Edward's lawyers shattered that assumption by presenting the original 1963 deed. The document proves that Philip had legally severed the financial assets from the physical title 60 years ago. He had transferred the ownership of the land and the revenue streams to the Southern Counties Trust, naming Edward as the sole beneficiary when he became an adult. The title could go back to the crown, but the money was locked in Edward's name. This discovery is causing immense panic within the palace. The revenue from those farms alone is nearly £2 million a year. Charles has already spent a huge chunk of that income on other projects. If the High Court enforces the 1963 deed, Charles will have to pay his brother back every single penny out of his own pocket. The document also includes a clause about Edward's residency. It states that the beneficiary holds a lifetime lease on any property purchased by the trust, independent of royal approval. This protects Edward's home at Bagshot Park. Charles cannot evict him, raise his rent, or force him to move to a smaller cottage. This sets a dangerous precedent for the king. If private deeds from past royals can block the current sovereign, then the king's power is severely limited. Princess Anne is reportedly acting as a mediator between her two brothers. She visited Buckingham Palace to meet with Charles and then traveled to Bagshot Park to speak with Edward. Anne understands the danger of a public legal war. She knows that if the contents of the 1963 trust become public, the taxpayer will see exactly how much private wealth the family has hidden away. This could severely damage public support for the monarchy. Edward remains resolute. He showed his sister the original parchment with their father's bold signature. He explained that this wasn't about challenging Charles's role as king, it was about honoring their father's wish to protect the younger branch of the family. Edward has spent his whole life being the compliant, quiet prince, and he believes that backing down now would betray his father. The mystery shifts to another folder found in the same bank vault. Edward's lawyers have hinted that the 1963 document is only the first phase of their claim. There is a second envelope, signed by Queen Elizabeth in 1999, dealing with the personal jewelry and art collections. If that document follows the same legal logic, Edward may lay claim to a significant portion of the royal art collection currently on display in London. Charles finds himself in an impossible position. He can give in quietly, handing over millions and admitting his father outmaneuvered him, or he can fight his brother in a private tribunal, risking a massive internal rift. The green leather desk in his office remains covered in legal briefs, but the 60-year-old parchment from the bank is the only document that truly matters. To get the full picture, we need to look at what happened behind closed doors at Bagshot Park. Sophie, the Duchess of Edinburgh, stood by the tall window of the library, watching a delivery van leave through the security gates. It was a cold Thursday afternoon last month. On the table behind her sat three cardboard boxes filled with blue legal ledger books, the internal accounts of the Bagshot estate dating back to 1999. Edward sat at the table writing notes with a black pen. The scene inside the room was nothing like the polished image of royal relaxation usually shown to the public. This was a war room. Two lawyers sat opposite the prince, surrounded by open binders, property surveys, and land tax receipts. They had spent the last 48 hours cross-referencing every penny Edward and Sophie had personally invested in the property against the official maintenance grants provided by the Crown Estate. The facts of the Bagshot Park lease are central to understanding this meeting. In 1999, after their wedding, Edward and Sophie signed a 50-year lease on the 120-room mansion. The property sits on 51 acres of prime land. Under the terms, Edward paid a one-off sum to secure the tenancy, but the agreement required him to pay for all internal repairs out of his own pocket. Over nearly 3 decades, those repairs added up to over £3 million of private inheritance money, used to repair the brickwork, replace leaking roofs, and upgrade ancient heating systems. They did this believing the property would be safe for their children, Lady Louise and James. The tension escalated when King Charles sent a palace surveyor to Bagshot Park without warning. The king's plan was simple. He wanted to split the 51-acre estate into three parcels. The main mansion would be leased out to a luxury hotel group, and Edward and Sophie would be moved to a smaller cottage. Charles justified this under his strict modernization code. He told his advisors that a non-working royal household didn't need a 120-room mansion. The king's team believed that because the crown estate held the ultimate ownership of the land, Edward would have to comply. They expected the quiet compliance he had shown his whole career. But the atmosphere in the library that afternoon was anything but compliant. Sophie refused to be forced out for a commercial hotel. She pointed to a specific stack of receipts from 2004 that detailed a complete overhaul of the stable blocks. That project had been funded entirely by a private gift from Queen Elizabeth herself. The late Queen had specifically noted in her diary that the stables were being converted for the long-term equestrian training of her grandchildren. Edward's lawyers found their ultimate defense buried in those records. They discovered that when the Queen provided the funds, she signed a concurrent waiver as the head of the Crown estate. This waiver stated that any capital improvements funded by her private purse would automatically extend the lease protection by an additional 25 years for each major project. This discovery changed the legal math completely. The original 50-year lease, set to run until 2049, is now legally locked until 2074. Edward and his heirs hold an unbreakable right of occupancy that extends well past the lifetime of King Charles and Prince William. The king cannot evict them or alter the boundaries without committing a breach of contract. The remaining mystery was whether the king's advisors would try to bypass this property lock by attacking Edward's personal income instead. Charles could reduce the allowances Edward used to pay his household staff and security detail. He could starve him out of the property without breaking the lease. But the lawyers resolved that mystery by producing the second part of their legal strategy. They pulled out a confidential financial agreement signed between Prince Philip and the Duchy of Cornwall in 1985. At that time, Charles was expanding his organic farming ventures and needed a significant loan from his father to purchase land near Highgrove. Philip agreed to the loan, but he attached a reciprocal clause that remained dormant for 40 years. The clause stated that if the Duchy of Cornwall, or the reigning sovereign ever, reduced the customary financial provisions for the younger branches of the family below the 1985 baseline, the outstanding balance of the Highgrove loan would become instantly repayable to Prince Philip's chosen beneficiary. That beneficiary is Prince Edward. If Charles cuts Edward's household budget by even a single pound, he triggers a legal demand for a £12 million cash repayment from the duchy funds. When the senior attorney explained this clause to Sophie, she closed her binder and smiled. The financial trap was perfectly set. Prince Philip had anticipated every single administrative move his eldest son would make decades before he ever took the throne. He used Charles's own past financial dependencies to protect his youngest son's future. The meeting at Bagshot Park concluded as the rain began to clear. Edward signed copies of the formal legal response. They were not emotional pleas. They were cold, precise, and backed by 5 decades of financial receipts. The lawyers packed up and left for their London offices. The showdown showed that the battle for the crown's wealth is no longer fought with royal decrees. It is fought in the fine print of lease agreements and decades-old loan clauses. Edward and Sophie had spent 3 years letting the palace believe they were cornered. In reality, they were just waiting until they had verified every signature. The response from Buckingham Palace arrived later that evening via a brief text message. The King's team requested an immediate suspension of the surveyor's orders while they reviewed the new findings. The attempt to downsize the Edinburgh family had failed before it even started. The quietest royals had turned their home into an unassailable fortress, and the king was left holding a massive bill for an argument he could not win. Now, panic is spreading through the palace corridors. A sharp knock on the door of the legal department at 8:00 on a Friday morning woke the senior staff to an immediate crisis. The king's principal private solicitor sat at a long table covered in cold coffee cups and printouts of the Duchy of Lancaster Charter. Senior advisors from the Treasury were already present, having arrived by private car from Whitehall just 30 minutes earlier. The 7-day deadline was ticking away, and the palace had no viable response. Clerks pulled heavy leather-bound ledger books from the basement archives beneath Buckingham Palace. These books contain the private estate records of Queen Elizabeth from the mid-1990s. The legal team checked every transaction to see if other hidden waivers or loan clauses existed. They looked for an escape hatch, but every document they opened only confirmed the strength of Edward's position. The specific fear gripping the palace was the terrifying precedent this case sets. For over a century, the reigning sovereign has operated under the assumption of absolute financial dominance. The king speaks, the treasury allocates, and the junior royals comply. If Edward can use private contracts to defy a direct command from the king, that dominance is gone forever. This realization sent shockwaves through the other royal households. Over at the royal lodge, Prince Andrew watched closely. Andrew has spent over 2 years resisting pressure to vacate his home. The moment he learned that Edward's lawyers had successfully frozen the king's property plans, he requested copies of the legal framework to see if he could apply the same strategy. The panic quickly spread to the Duchy of Cornwall offices. Prince William's administrative team realized their own financial projections were in jeopardy. The duchy relies on stable land revenues to fund William's public work. If Philip's loan clause is triggered, William's estate will be forced to pay £12 million instantly, wiping out a huge chunk of its liquid assets and forcing William to halt several charitable initiatives. Tension between the king and princess, Anne reached an all-time high during a closed-door meeting at Clarence House. Anne had spent the previous 48 hours trying to broker a quiet compromise. She proposed a middle ground. Edward could keep the house, but he would surrender a portion of the commercial land revenues. Edward's lawyers rejected the proposal out of hand. When Anne reported this back to Charles, he was immensely frustrated. He viewed Edward's refusal as a direct act of insubordination during a highly sensitive period. A public legal battle would look damaging on the front pages of the newspapers. It would portray the family as an argumentative corporation fighting over hidden wealth rather than a dedicated institution of public service. The legal team spent the afternoon reviewing the specific powers of the Crown Estate Commissioners to see if they could launch a countersuit. They looked at an old 1961 Act of Parliament to see if they could declare any private lease null and void. The investigation yielded nothing. The 1961 Act explicitly protects the rights of existing tenants if they have fulfilled their maintenance obligations. Edward's £3 million investment made him an unassailable tenant. By 5:00, the head of the legal team walked out and instructed his secretary to schedule an urgent meeting with Edward's lead attorney. There would be no aggressive countersuit. There would be no royal decree. The palace was entering a phase of damage control, going to the negotiating table from a position of total weakness. The quiet prince had completely outmaneuvered the entire palace apparatus without ever making a public statement. The final conference call concluded at noon on Monday. King Charles sat alone in his study, looking at a single sheet of paper. It was the formal concession framework. He had no choice but to sign it. Launching a high court battle would expose the family's private financial records to public scrutiny during a time of economic strain and personal health challenges for senior royals. A public war over millions of pounds would be catastrophic. By signing, Charles formally acknowledged that the late Queen's private wishes and Prince Philip's 1963 trust take absolute legal precedence. The Crown Estate dropped its demands to reclaim the land parcels around Bagshot Park. The commercial revenues remain locked under Edward's control, securing an independent financial empire for his branch of the family. The quietest prince had won a definitive victory using the precise legal tools left behind by his parents. This sudden fracture leaves the palace in a vulnerable position. Charles's vision of a streamlined central monarchy has suffered a definitive blow. He cannot freely redistribute crown properties or slash budgets without facing immediate legal consequences. The hidden clauses in Philip's estate planning have established an unbreakable barrier around Edward's household. The balance of power has shifted dramatically, proving that even a reigning king cannot rewrite history when the fine print is ironclad. The lines have been drawn. King Charles wanted absolute control, but Prince Edward's lawyers just proved that the late Queen's final wishes cannot be overridden. This silent rebellion changes the family's financial dynamic for generations to come.